He looked me dead in the eye and said, "People like you don't save anyone." And the room laughed, just like they always do. But if they knew what I'd done, if they knew who I really was, they would have swallowed those words before they ever reached me. My name is Katie. And that night, their cruelty finally collided with the truth I'd buried for years. Lake Winlow hadn't changed. The snow still piled high along the roadside like silent barricades, and the old pine trees still leaned the same way they always had, as if bracing for another long winter. When I pulled into my Uncle Jim's driveway, the warm glow from his windows washed across the yard, making everything look softer than it really was. Pretty. Almost. But I knew better. I knew exactly what waited on the other side of that door, the familiar choreography of roles everyone had agreed on years ago. They were all gathered for Lila's wedding weekend, buzzing with energy before the big day. She floated around the living room in a new dress, every hair in place, every gesture timed for maximum charm. Mark stood beside her like a spotlight in human form, recounting stories from the station that made everyone lean in a little too eagerly. He spoke with an ease that told me he was used to being listened to. The moment I stepped inside, the script began. How was the flight? Must be cold. Still doing that job with the department. Each question delivered with the same polite rhythm. Each answer taken as confirmation that nothing about me had changed since the last holiday gathering. I nodded, smiled, let their assumptions settle into the spaces they'd always occupied. I slipped into the last chair at the table, the one that never belonged to anyone but somehow always belonged to me. From there, I watched the orbit of attention swirl around Lila and Mark while I stayed precisely where everyone expected. Dinner was warm, the room was cheerful, but beneath it all, the same quiet pressure pressed against my ribs, the unspoken rule that I should remain small so the evening could keep its shine. I had no intention of disrupting anything tonight, but arrogance has a way of finding its moment, and as I listened to the rising laughter around me, I felt it gathering, waiting for the exact second to strike. Dinner shifted almost instantly once someone asked Mark to tell the story the one he clearly waited all night to be invited to share. He sat up straighter, rolled his shoulders back, and the entire table quieted as if he were about to recount a medal ceremony. Forks froze midway. Even Lila rested her chin on her hand like she'd heard it 100 times and still couldn't get enough. He went straight into the red port explosion, the shriek of metal collapsing, the ceiling trembling over their helmets, the black chemical smoke rolling through the corridors. He painted it so vividly the room turned still. Every detail delivered with the kind of bravado a man earns from being applauded too often for the same story. But I knew those details for a different reason. I set my fork down slowly, letting my pulse even out as he described the exact moment the West Wing folded. The numbers he mentioned, the timing, the shift, the direction matched perfectly with what I'd watched on my screens 3 years ago. His team trapped in Shaft 3B, the heat blooming too fast in the corridor ahead, the point where a single misstep would have ended them, because I had been the one watching them disappear and reappear in blotches of heat. I had been the one who told them which way to go. Mark didn't know that. He also didn't know he was stitching every breadcrumb of my buried memory right into the center of his performance. He leaned back, basking in the attention, and added that the voice guiding them sounded like a seasoned man, apparently the type whose tone had seen things. A man, he insisted, because no woman would sound that calm when the ceiling was coming down. Everyone nodded along like that made perfect sense. I let myself smile small, controlled, inward. Not because any of this was funny, but because a strange realization clicked into place. Mark had absolutely no idea he was giving me back fragments of my own story, and he was doing it with full confidence that it never belonged to me in the first place. It didn't take long before the spotlight on Mark dimmed just enough for someone to remember I existed. Someone asked about my work, but Lila cut in before I even inhaled. Katie's probably drowning in paperwork. Those analyst types lose it if the copy machine jams. The table cracked up the kind of laughter that lands before anyone checks if it should. I took a sip of water, letting the cold steady my breath, while the familiar sting settled low in my chest. I could have mentioned the hours I'd spent locked inside a concrete room watching a bomb timer blink towards 0, but no one was asking for that kind of truth. Not here. Not from me. Then, like she always tried to help but never chose the right words, Dee Carroll chimed in. She said Lila once told her I wasn't built for real danger, that I was the safe one, the type who'd never last in a situation where decisions carried actual consequences. Lila didn't even blink, just shrugged, as if confirming a fact everyone already accepted. A quiet understanding crawled over me then. They didn't just misunderstand what I did. They needed me to stay small so Lila could keep shining bright. The Redport Secrets. Mark didn't know that was one kind of wound, but the way my own family shaped the narrative of who I was, that was the deeper cut, the one that had been bleeding for years, and I could feel both wounds, past and present, beginning to line up perfectly, like two storm fronts preparing to collide. The room glittered with the kind of warmth that never reached me. Silverware clinked, glasses chimed, and Mark slipped right back into his favorite battlefield, the center of attention. He leaned forward, elbows planted like a man about to deliver a heroic monologue, and dove straight into Redport again. But this version was even more warped than before. He said he found the opening to Shaft 3B. He said he made the call to change direction. He said listening to intel would have gotten them all cooked alive. Everyone laughed as if he were delivering a stand-up routine rather than rewriting a night people almost died. Lila touched his shoulder with that smug sort of affection, the kind meant to remind everyone she'd won some prize. I didn't move, because I remembered the truth. Shaft 3B wasn't his discovery. It was the exact moment I'd watched a heat bloom spike on the Northwest scan, the moment I'd rerouted them, the moment where a wrong call would have meant watching lives vanish off my screen one by one. Then he added the line that nearly locked my breath in my chest. Analysts panicked under pressure. He said, the voice on the radio was shaky, terrified. My voice. The table erupted again, everyone basking in a version of the story that had never belonged to them. And as Mark kept piling on details he didn't earn, unintentionally echoing decisions I had made, I felt the atmosphere begin to shift. His embellishments were getting too close to the truth, so close he didn't see the cliff edge he was walking toward. I stayed silent. But my silence wasn't submission this time. It was the crack before the break. It happened just as plates were being cleared. Mark stood abruptly, straightening himself like a man preparing for a speech. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a black cloth. The room quieted almost instantly, drawn into his gravity. He said he carried it everywhere, a reminder of the night he almost died. When he unwrapped it, my pulse stuttered. A charred piece of metal, warped at the edges, darkened by fire. I recognized it immediately, not because I had touched it, but because I'd watched it fall on thermal imaging seconds after I warned them to move left. Now it sat on the table like a piece of the truth had been dropped between the dinner rolls. Guests passed it around reverently. When it returned to Mark, he added the detail that sealed the moment they'd found it at the West Junction, right after the radio redirected them. The West Junction, the exact location I had flagged, the exact call he was claiming as his own. I lifted my gaze and didn't look away this time. Lila laughed, trying to cut the tension, asking if I'd ever seen anything that intense before. Her voice dripped with condescension, but it barely registered. My fingers rested on my glass, the cold grounding me as everything aligned, every lie, every detail, every memory. The game had shifted. And for the first time all night, Mark sensed it. The mood around the table shifted so abruptly, it felt like someone had dimmed the lights. Lila set her fork down with a theatrical flourish, turning her engagement ring under the glow like she was preparing to take center stage. She looked straight at me, a practiced sweetness coating her voice as she asked what I actually contributed, while Mark risked his life for others. The room quieted, waiting for whatever performance she'd rehearsed in her head. She tilted her chin, smiling with that polished cruelty she'd perfected since childhood, and wondered if I spent my workdays pushing spreadsheets. The mockery was gentle enough to look like a joke, but sharp enough to slice exactly where she meant it to. My mother let out a soft chuckle, one that said she'd heard this kind of commentary before and never questioned it. My uncle nodded along, as if Lila had simply pointed out an obvious truth. Their eyes drifted toward me with a familiar blend of amusement and dismissal, the look people give when they believe they already know your limits, and want you to stay within them. Then Mark joined in, laughing as though he were sharing an innocent anecdote. He talked about how people in support roles panicked easily, how smoke made them gag, how real action separated those who could handle pressure from those who folded under it. He said it casually, carelessly, without thinking for even a moment that someone at the table might find the words heavy. His confidence pulsed through the room. Every nod of agreement dug the blade deeper. I held his gaze, and something inside me settled not in defeat, but in recognition. They weren't interested in learning who I was or what I'd done. They'd spent years building a version of me that made them feel secure in their roles, and they clung to that version even when reality brushed against it. Then Lila leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the pleasure of delivering a final blow, and asked if I had ever saved anyone. The question wasn't naive, it was an indictment, a reminder of the hierarchy she believed in, the one where she stood bright and important while I was expected to remain dull and quiet, my palm pressed lightly against the wooden table, the cool surface grounding me. The line she crossed wasn't just rude, it was the kind of line you don't step back from once it's been breached. My silence wasn't endurance anymore, it was the decision before the storm. Mark placed his glass down with deliberation, as if preparing to unveil some profound truth. He said he remembered the voice from Redport, the one that guided them through fire and collapse, and described it with absolute certainty. It was a man's voice, he said. Steady, commanding, the kind you could only develop after years in high-risk operations. Never a woman's. Because a woman, according to him, would have lost her composure the moment things turned deadly. His arrogance hit the table like a slammed door. I inhaled slowly, the controlled breath I'd trained myself to take before making difficult calls, and set my own glass down with a soft but decisive tap. The room stilled instantly. I met his eyes and let the cadence I had buried deep rise to the surface. Unit 6, hold position. Heat increase ahead. Debris imminent. Turn left now. The words dropped into the room like live wires. Mark recoiled so violently his chair skidded backward, crashing to the floor. A startled gasp escaped someone at the opposite end of the table, but the sound barely registered. I kept going, because the sequence demanded completion. Shaft 3B clear. Right side unstable. Ceiling collapse in 3 seconds. Keep moving! Mark's hand shook as he grabbed the edge of the table. His face leached of color. He muttered a broken denial. But I wasn't done. Team 2, maintain speed. West exit accessible. Thermal overload approaching. 90 seconds. Silence crashed over the room with the force of a closing vault. Every breath around me froze. I let my voice return to its normal tone and asked if he remembered now. His eyes widened with a dawning horror that carved straight through his pride. He whispered that only the voice on the radio knew those details, the precise temperatures, the collapse timing, the heat patterns. Recognition hit him like a blow. The woman he'd mocked all night had once held his life in her hands. Lila covered her mouth as mascara streaked down her cheeks. My family stared at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time, but clarity often arrives too late. The air was thick with the truth they'd spent years avoiding, and now that truth was loose, irreversible, and burning its way through every lie they had ever told about me. There was no putting it back. Mark stared at me as if the entire room had vanished, leaving only the memory of red heat, falling metal, and the voice that pulled him through it. I watched the moment the realization hit him slow at first, then sharp enough to crack through every lie he'd repeated tonight. For years, he'd imagined a seasoned man guiding him out of that inferno. Now he was seeing the truth in front of him, and it shook him to the core. His breath came unsteady as he finally managed to speak. You were the voice, the one who let us out. I let the silence hold a beat before I asked if he remembered the temperature spike on the east side. Seconds before the ceiling came down. His eyes widened. That detail had never appeared in any official report. Exactly, I said. I wasn't writing reports. I was making the calls. The table went still. Even the air felt frozen. Lila jumped up, accusing me of ruining her night, her voice cracking under the weight of her own fear. I reminded her she'd asked if I'd ever saved anyone. Now she knew. Mark's shoulders sagged under a truth he couldn't escape. You saved my life, and I mocked you for it. I didn't comfort him. I didn't need to. You survived. That was the point. And the room saw me, truly saw me for the first time. The air in the room tightened until it felt heavy enough to hold in my hands. Mark looked at me like he was bracing for judgment. But that was never mine to give. All I had ever offered him then and now was the truth. His voice trembled when he finally spoke, each word fragile, as if admitting it out loud might fracture something inside him. He said he had believed he was the one leading his team that night, that without him they would have been lost. The shame in his eyes wasn't about the lie itself, but about realizing he'd repeated it so often he'd built his identity around it. I nodded, slowly, letting him steady himself. I told him he wasn't wrong about the courage it took to enter a burning building. He had pulled a teammate from a blocked hallway. He had risked his own safety. Nothing could take that away from him. But the leadership he claimed hadn't belonged to him, and using that night as a weapon against others was the part he had to face. Silence exploded around us like a shockwave. Lila hurried forward, grabbing his hand, trying to drag him back into the story where she still held the spotlight. She insisted he didn't need to listen to me, that I was humiliating her on purpose. Her voice cracked under the weight of a truth she couldn't outrun. Mark pulled his hand from hers. Not harshly, but with a finality that made her flinch. He said he did need to hear it, and so did she. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the charred piece of metal, and placed it in my palm. The warmth of his hand lingered for a moment before he let go. He said it had never belonged to him, that it had always belonged to the person who guided them through the dark. Lila's face twisted, disbelief turning to panic. She demanded to know what that meant for her, for them, what he intended to do with their future. Mark exhaled, the kind of long-waited breath a man releases when he can no longer lie to himself. He said he couldn't marry someone who built herself up by tearing others down, especially not when the person she belittled had once kept him alive. Lila's scream tore through the silence. She threw her napkin to the floor and ran upstairs, the slam of the bedroom door echoing like the final crack of something breaking open. My parents lowered their gazes, unwilling to meet mine, as if looking at me might force them to acknowledge everything they'd ignored for years. They didn't apologize. They couldn't. Fear had filled the space where acceptance should have been, and that fear told me everything I needed to know. I stepped onto the porch and pulled my coat close, letting the cold Minnesota air settle around me. Snow drifted down in slow, quiet flakes, landing without fuss on the railing. The steps, my sleeves steady, self-contained, not needing an audience to be real. I breathed out, watching the cloud of it disappear into the night. Behind me, the front door clicked shut. No footsteps followed. No one rushed out to call my name or offer a late apology. The house simply returned to its stillness, as if the evening's eruption had never happened. For once, that silence didn't cut. It felt like release. I walked toward my car, each crunch of snow under my boots grounding me more firmly in myself. When I slid into the driver's seat, my phone lit up on the console, an early morning assignment waiting for confirmation. A part of me warmed at the sight, not from pride, but from recognition. That was the world where my decisions mattered, where my voice wasn't questioned, where the weight of what I did wasn't measured against someone else's ego. A small smile tugged at me. Not triumph, not revenge, just truth settling into place. I eased down to the driveway, the headlights cutting clean paths through fresh snow. At the curve above Winlow Lake, I paused long enough to see the glow of the house reflected faintly across the thin layer of ice. From this distance, it looked more like a set that had been struck lights still on. Story finished. I didn't look back again. There was nothing left inside that house for me to prove or explain. No dignity I needed to reclaim. I wasn't leaving because I was hurt. I was leaving because I finally understood I didn't belong in a place that required me to be small. As I turned onto the main road, snow swirled through the beams of my headlights, soft and steady. My silence was never emptiness. It was depth, and not everyone knows how to hear it.